So the first thing that I'm going to just take a look at here, or bring to your attention, right, is the extreme jankiness of that selection process that was going on there, right? So if you imagine, like, we've kind of got this working, and some of it is pretty good, but you can kind of see that this stuff is really pretty random and janky at this point. Because in a real scenario, if you imagine when we actually go to try and use this, the obvious thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to select one of these entities or something, and then I'm going to want to go over here and interact with it. But just by the nature of how it works, right, I've kind of got the situation where I hover over it and it shows the thing, and then if I was to go over here to try and interact with whatever it was, it would go away because I'm no longer hovering over it, right? So at the very least, we need to start having things like the ability to like click and select something, So that's, something we definitely would want to do. But if you think about what happens there, we have a few more problems even deeper than that. And even deeper than that is just that activity even of itself. Right now, it conflicts with any selection that I might do for the actual system, right? So in here, like that little nub is a selectable nub. You'll notice that when I select the nub, now technically I'm highlighting both the tree and the nub, right? So there's no concept in the system of what, the fact that both the debug system and the game now have things that might want to be part of a debug UI interaction. And that's not going to fly, right? What's going to happen if we let that stand is that as I try to interact with things in here, I will be silently selecting like entities underneath and ruining whatever it was that I was trying to work on. So we need the debug system and the game to have a unified understanding of what a debug interaction is and who is actually doing stuff with it. And in addition to that, we need to do a thing where we can have that be as unintrusive, like we need that to be as transparent to the game as possible, because we don't want all the code, all of the code in the game to get complexified by like inserting code into it that's just for dealing with the debug system. So we, ideally we want as much complexity as we can in that system to live inside the debug system itself, and as little of the complexity as possible to live on the side of the game, so that it's easy for the game to sort of expose new things that might get clicked on or that might get selected for debugging purposes without having to like complexify the code that's being debugged. Because the last thing we want to do is export complexity from the debug system out into the game, because the debug system's only supposed to be for debugging. It should be as easy as possible to use. So if we take a look at where this is actually happening, right, in handmade hero.cpp, we have this thing here where we sort of have like begin data block hot entity. We can see that this code right here is the code that like does the picking. We loop over the volumes for the, we loop over the collision volumes for a given entity, and then we look at whether the mouse is over them or whatever. Now, what we want to do here, ideally, is have some way that this would interact with our debug system. And what we can see, like when we look at this code, right, is that it probably wouldn't be very difficult for us to just do something that said, like, okay, when we're going to begin this data block or when we're going to push this data block, you could imagine something probably pretty straightforward, which was just some way of asking the debug system, like, hey, should I push this data block or not, right? Or maybe it's a speculative push or something like that. You could imagine ways in which this would work. All of this stuff goes into this data block, right? You can see it happening there. And one thing that I could do is just make that data block somehow magically predicate itself on one of these interaction things, right? So that's the first thing that I'm going to look at as an option, because ideally, since we know that like this is the minimum that we have to do, either, and this, maybe in the future we can get this down to something even swankier where we're just like debug auto data block and we say something, like this, right? We might be able to do something like that using the metaprogramming stuff that we wrote if we wanted to, because all of this stuff, right, could be automatically determined from there. So we know that we might be able to get it down to a much simpler thing in terms of us not having to specify all the values, but the only thing that really would be different there is that the sort of metaprogram knows where all the values are, and that's why we don't have to do it, but it would still get sort of pushed in the exact same way. So it would just be this code automatically generated. So basically we know that this code is what's going to run for sure. And we could simplify it down quite nicely with a metaprogram if we wanted to, so that's good. So all we need to think about now is how do we simplify the fact that it is an interaction that might involve like the concept of selecting something or something like this, right? So the other thing that I want to point out to you is this occurs, this exporting of the data. Right now, this exporting of the data occurs inside the thing that selects the entity, right? And the fact that it occurs inside the thing that selects the entity means that if the entity were not being hovered, this data would not be exported. Now, that's not necessarily a problem because the debug system could keep a copy of it if it wanted to, keep displaying it. We could do that. It wouldn't be particularly difficult. But the problem with that is it means that once you're no longer hovering over the entity, the data would no longer update, right? Because this is what actually sends the data to the debug system. And so if we don't have this getting called every frame, then the debug system will not know of, if these things change. Like let's say the entity's moving, this p-value will change every frame, but if we only sent it when we were hovering, then if you like clicked on it, select it as an entity that you want to view for a while, and it shows up in a window on the side, when you then stop hovering over that entity, the p would no longer update, right? And neither would anything else, because it's not getting updated at all. It's not getting sent. So more likely, the thing that I suspect we would want to do is something like this, right? And this is just me conceptualizing how I suspect this would have to work in order to do what I want it to do. Which is that as we loop through these entities here, right, and you can see us dealing with these entities, we do our updates and all that stuff. We have a thing here that does the collision detection. What I probably want to do is say, you know what? At the end of all this stuff, after we do the collision detection, right, which is all this stuff, and we don't need this anymore. Excuse me. Right. There we go. So after we do all of this stuff, we do the collision detection, which is only really necessary for debug mode. So you might say this should be something where we do handmade internal. We could also have sort of another thing for this, which is like if, debug UI enabled or something like this, right? You could imagine it being something like this. But basically what we have is a section where we do our hit testing for that debug stuff, right? And then we have an output for the debug stuff. And what I'd like to do is decouple these. So what I'd like to do is say, okay, the hit testing happens, and if we have a situation where we hit test somebody and it turns out that that somebody is the guy who was outlined, then I'd like to have something in here where we can sort of announce that to the debug system, like if debug, hit data, I don't know, something like this, hit thing, I don't know, if debug hit. And we want to sort of announce this thing, and we kind of know what this thing is, right? It's this is its ID, right, that we decided it had. That was a pointer that it had there. So if, you hit this thing, then what we would like to do is we'd like to display it or whatever, and otherwise, maybe we don't. And then same with here, we like if debug, system, maybe I just say if the debug system wants whatever this thing is, then we'd sort of open this data block and stream out the values to it, right? And that would be something more like this. If maybe we would call it even something like this. We just have the data block in there. Maybe it opens it automatically, and we just say if debug begin like optional data block or something, and here that is. So in that case, now we have a situation where the debug system itself can sort of ask for which entities it wants to have updated, and some logic can occur behind the scenes to make sure all of this stuff gets integrated with the debug UI system itself. And so in here we would say, hey, we have a hit. Do you want us to highlight it, basically? Do you want us to do a highlight of that or something like this? Yes or no. And I suppose the other thing we could sort of do here, we could sort of have a thing where, this could sort of have a double meaning as well. Maybe it could have something a little more substantial associated with it. So for example, when we do this operation, we could do something more like this, where instead of the operation, let's do it something like this. We could do a two-part thing where we say, okay, if the thing is true, then we have a debug hit, and then we could also have a thing here. Maybe we said, okay, there was a debug hit and there was a debug or like highlighted, right? And the other thing that you can see about this is we have a lot of sort of the same thing going on here with this nonsense. And so I also feel like we would want to have a way of encapsulating that debug ID, you know? So if we took a look at the way the debug ID thing was working there, debug ID, that's in platform. Oh, sorry, we moved that out recently. It's actually in debug interface. So in here where we have this notion of like the debug ID, which is, I guess, not in here, it's actually in here, as it turns out. So if we have this notion of a debug ID, you know, we can make that print out information. That information goes into the debug buffers and those unified so that we can use them in the game as well. The collation code, so it doesn't actually have to exist for a to then played with. In this case, you know, you can see that there's a lot of kind of concept here of a thing that gets out, right? You can see that there's jankiness there. It's like, you know, while it's highlighting the way it's not, which is understandable, you know, just a number of problems there were like, okay, so maybe we need to be able to click on something and we need to be able to store the information about that thing a little bit better. There's all sorts of things that we kind of need to start doing and having a more coherent plan for. So that's what I'd like to start out doing. Maybe we'll just start out with something very simple, like starting to get just debug UI interactions in general, like we had that sort of radial menu. Print out information, that information goes into the debug buffer today, so if you start with the same code, we will be in sync, like the band, like the Backstreet Boys, but different. Sync, like the band, because that is the code that I am going to start with today, so if you start with the same code, we will be in sync, like the band. If you start with the same and unpack that into a direct home, and you pre-order the game is the code that I am going to start with today. So if you start with the same code, pack that into at home, and so if you would sort of have an idea of what that looks like. Again, today is day 212, so if you would like to follow along with the code we do today at home, and you pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, you can go ahead and unpack that into a directory, because that is the code that I am going to start with today. So if you start with the same code, we will be in sync, like the band, like the Backstreet Boys, but different. All right, so here's where we left things on Friday. You can see that actually the stuff that we wanted to do is working. You can highlight entities and print out information. That information goes into the debug buffers and then kind of gets picked up later by the collation code, so it doesn't actually have to exist for a long period of time. It doesn't have to exist even at the end of the frame. It's something that can just kind of be captured and then played with. But things that are interactable, such as like expandable things, or like in this case, you know, we got the idea of what that looks like. Again, today is day 212, so if you would like to follow along with the code we do today at home, and you pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, you can go ahead and unpack that into a directory, because that is the code that I am going to start with today. So if you start with the same code, we will be in sync, like the band, like the Backstreet Boys, but different. All right, so here's where we left things on Friday. You can see that actually the stuff that we wanted to do is working. You can highlight entities and you know, interesting happening in there, and these routines don't really have to care. They just know that they're going to operate off of that, right? So now what will happen, in theory at least, is that, well, actually, I guess technically absolutely nothing, I would think. Although now that I think about it too, debug highlight, and I guess I should have thought of this beforehand, but I only thought of it just now when that didn't work, is anyway, right? Which is exactly what we want. We've kind of got like, you know, but anyway, that's the basics of it. We've gotten to the end of the stream, so I'll go ahead and switch over to the Q&A. Pass one. It's hard to say because they're volumes, and some of them are hollow and some of them aren't, so it would depend on which kind of volume it was. Probably if it's a hollow volume, you'd pass it one way, and if it was not a hollow volume, you'd pass it the other. So it's a little bit tricky just about how those work. But anyway, that's the basics of it. We've gotten to the end of the stream, so I'll go ahead and switch over to the Q&A for now. But you can see kind of how we'd start extending that tomorrow. All right, Q&A time. If you have questions about what we were doing, please post them with a Q colon. Oh wait, you know what? That's not actually true because I started with like 10 minutes on the clock. So forget that. I can do the selection. I'm going to go ahead and do the selection because I was about to do that. We might as well do the selection part as well, right? That seems like a good idea to me. And furthermore, I feel like we could do something like this. Potentially. You know what I'm saying to you? I don't know that that's a good idea, but I'm going to do it anyway, because why not? I've got 10 minutes left on the clock, so I'm going to use them. I'm going to use them to nefarious ends, is what I'm going to do. I am just going to go ahead and straight up do weird stuff with that. So yeah, I am just going to go ahead and why not? I've got 10 minutes left. Why not? I've got 10 minutes. You know what? Oh wait, you know what? That's not actually true because I started with like 10 minutes on the clock. So forget that. I can do the selection. I'm going to go ahead and do the selection because I was about to do that. We might as well do the selection. This. I'm going to left on the quit anyway because why not? I've got 10 minutes left on the clock, so I'm going to use them. I'm going to use them, but I'm going to do it anyway because why not? I've got going to do it anyway because why not? I've got 10 minutes left on the clock, so I'm going to use them. I'm going to use them to nefarious ends, is what I'm going to do. I am just going to go ahead and straight up do weird stuff with that. So yeah, so debug highlighted, V for color, and what I'll do is ahead and straight up do weird various ends, is what I'm going to do. I am just going to go ahead and straight up do weird stuff with that. So yeah, so debug highlighted, V for color, and what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and write to that. You know, another thing that I should point out, I don't know if I ever explicitly mentioned this, you'll notice on the stream, whenever I compile something out, I always just use ... as the parameters, because now that C++ supports variadic macros, it just means that you don't have to change the compiled out version every time you change the parameters. So like right there, I did debug highlighted, I added a V4 color to it. It means that now when it compiles out, I don't have to go change that place as well, right? And that's just kind of nice. So yeah. So here's what we'll do. We'll say something like this. If is selected, result equals true. If debug IDs are equal, result equals true. But in this case, we will use one color, and in this case, we will use another color. So in this case, we know that if something is selected, for example, maybe that's cyan, who knows why, it just is. And then in another case, it's yellow, right? And so now if we run this, we should see no change from before, right? So everything is yellow, like for highlight. And then now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and implement some selection in here, hopefully. So when we're interacting with things, I don't actually remember if we have anything in particular that I'd have to do for selection because it's kind of a straightforward thing to have happen. So I think the only real thing that I would need to do is like when you begin or hot intro. So we've got about 19. Okay, all right. Multi-select. All right. Okay, so now let's actually. Okay, so now let's actually go to the Q&A. So we've got about 19 minutes. So yeah. Okay. Okay, so now let's actually go to the Q&A. So we've got about 19 minutes. So yeah. Anyone who has questions can hit me with a Q colon. Is the InsoBot smart enough to know that it should use Q colon during the Q&A? Is the InsoBot smart enough to know that it should use Q colon during the Q&A? Disused simulatory. You can emulate expression blocks with lambdas if you don't mind the craziness of C++11. I do mind the craziness of C++11, of course. Mind the crazy expression. Disused simulatory. You can emulate expression blocks with lambdas if you don't mind the craziness of C++11. I do mind the craziness of C++11, of course. Chrono Dragon. InsoBot checks for your Q. Chrono Dragon. InsoBot checks for your QA thing, I believe. Yeah. So the InsoBot. At what point can we replace the chat with just InsoBots? And then at what point can we replace me with just some programming bot? And then it's just like bots showing bots some programming. Elvin, would you think it's better to start at a junior position at a company than working my way up, or try to apply for high position? Dude, I have no idea. I know nothing about modern hiring practices. I know nothing. Elvin, would you think it's better to start at a junior position at a company than working my way up, or try to apply for high position? Dude, I have no idea. I know nothing about modern hiring practices. Mr. Fourth Dimension, about universal IDs, what if some things want to be... Mr. Fourth Dimension, about universal IDs, what if some things want to be identified in the same system, but don't have fixed storage location or complex in some other way with the universal uniqueness? So what I generally do, you'll notice very specifically, this was even like sort of predictive of me, because we didn't actually have a need for it. But you'll notice in here, the way that I did it is there's 2 pointers, and it's like, why are there 2 pointers, right? And the reason is specifically because you can almost always generate a unique ID with enough space. And like, you know, I've seen it in my system sometimes as high as 4. But basically what it is like, okay, let's say that I've got something that only exists as some sequence of things that get executed in a for loop from 1 to whatever, and then, you know, I will typically like pile that stuff together where I'll just be like, okay, I know that this pointer uniquely identifies this set of things that I'm doing, and then the integer of the for loop would uniquely identify like which one of those it was, right? And so I typically find that if you, in systems where you want to use an ID, you can usually find a way to generate them, usually. Now, will it always work? Not necessarily, but certainly for a debug system, I think we'll be fine. Adamantois 17. Adamantois 17. Do you know yet if the Handmade talks are going to be streamed and or recorded? I do not yet know. I suspect we won't know probably up till pretty close to the event. Since I suspect we won't and or recorded. Adamantois 17. Do you know yet if the Handmade talks are going to be streamed and or recorded? I do not yet know. I suspect we won't know probably up till pretty close to the event, since that's like still kind of an active issue that I'm trying to get resolved. It's a lot harder than you might think to get people to actually reply to emails sometimes for whatever reasons. Flame Dog. Bots on bots. Flame... actually reply to emails sometimes for whatever reasons. Flame Dog. Bots on bots. Imagine of all the off by one errors. Well, I make off by one errors myself, and I'm not a bot, so... Keeper Caleb. Wouldn't bots be teaching bots how to program errors myself, and I'm... Bots, imagine of all the off by one errors. Well, I make off by one errors myself, and I'm not a bot, so... Keeper Caleb. Wouldn't... But I'm not a bot, so... Keeper Caleb. Wouldn't bots be teaching bots how to program be the beginning of the singularity, or the end of the singularity, depending on how good a teaching they were doing. League of WoW... League of WoW... depending on how good a teaching they were doing. League of WoW Escape. You have recommended the C programming language book after watching your directory series. Are there any other books you would suggest, such as proper programming practices or reference books? Not really. There probably are some out there, but I'm not up on them enough, if that makes sense. So I don't really know what probably the right books to read these days would be. That's not to say that there aren't good books to read these days. There probably are. I don't know what they are. Elvin, you mentioned that the pointer could be used as a key, and Elvin, you mentioned that the pointer... Elvin, you mentioned that the pointer could be used as a key, and the thing it's pointing to is the value. So do you mean something like this pair of x star x? I just mean as anything that implements a map, like a hash table or anything like that, you know. Veezy Treezy, what else are you working on outside of this project? So my main project, you can go to mollyrocket.com, and this is our dev blog here. You know, you can use the little buttons to like scroll through it. We have not announced the project yet. But this is the page for all of our announcements. So forget that. I can do about what we were doing. Please post them with a Q colon. Oh wait, you know what? That's not actually true because I started with like 10 minutes on the clock. So forget that. I can do the selection. I'm going to go ahead and do the selection because I was about to do that. We might as well do the selection part as well, right? That seems like a good idea to... you know, space. I don't know what they are. Implement... Veezy Treezy. What else are you working on outside of this project? So my main project, you can go to mollyrocket.com, and this is our dev blog here. You know, you can use the little buttons to like scroll through it. We have not announced the project yet, but this is the page for all of our announcements. Every Monday it gets posted, and you can also go to the follow page and there's a mailing list. So if you do want to know what we're working on, as soon as we announce it, it would go out on that. BB King Twitch, if you're just starting out to watch these videos and you don't have time to watch them all, which ones are most important? I wouldn't really say that there's a most or important or not. It's because the different thing about Handmade Hero is it's not trying to teach you any specific. I have to watch BB King Twitch. If you're just starting out to watch these videos and you don't have time to watch them all, which ones are most important? I wouldn't really say that there's a most or important or not. It's because the different thing about Handmade Hero is it's not trying to teach you any specific programming techniques. It's just trying to teach you one useful way of programming. So it's more just the mentality and how that and how you just generally approach problems. And so I wouldn't say that there's a particularly important or not important videos. I'd say just like, as long as you're understanding what I'm doing in the video, then they're all roughly equivalent. There are certain times where if really what you cared about was learning a very specific technique, maybe it's like, oh, I really wanted to learn how to rasterize a sprite, and then I watched the rasterizing the sprite episode, then obviously that's true. But, on the whole, it's not really supposed to sort of be that, if that makes sense. How do you pick apart code of other programs, websites, etc.? Sorry for the noobish spam, I just want to get started in the morning. I don't really pick apart other programs that much. I mean, sometimes I do, like when I was working on The Witness, and even I guess sometimes still today, if I have to work on The Witness, I mean, I have to go read the code of the other people who worked on the project or whatever. But, I mean, it's not like I have to, it's not like a reverse engineering job or anything like that, if that's what you mean. And most of the time I'm working on code that I wrote, so I'm really reading my own code most of the time. So I'm not sure I really understand the question. If maybe you mean something a little bit more different than sort of what I'm imagining that to be, but yeah. I'm not sure I understand really the question, maybe. Any other questions? Elvin, trying to work with others and reading their code, do you try to understand everything they wrote, or just understand enough to solve your problems? Well, I mean, it depends on the situation. I try to understand a fair bit about stuff, but I find that generally, like, it's at least like with The Witness, for example, it's a large enough code base that I'm not really going to understand it all unless I do work in it. Like, typically I have to do some work and break some stuff and then go, oh, I see, like, this system over here actually depends on this other system and I didn't know that, and then like fix it and go like, okay. And so, as I worked with certain parts of it, I certainly, got better at understanding those parts. But rarely is it the case that I like read the code and like totally understood like all the code before trying to make some changes to it, because oftentimes you can't really fully understand the code, at least I find I can't, just by reading it. It would have to be like it has to be like very, very small code for me to be able to do that. Most of the time I have to kind of push on it a little and go like, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. Like, I can't change this value because this other thing blows up or whatever. So I see how that gets picked up here or whatever, VZ Treezy, is there a programming pattern you see all the time that you can't stand or hate? I don't think so. I mean, usually the thing that I don't like... Well, getters and setters is one. I hate getters and setters. They're like the silliest thing. I don't get why they were ever a thing. So getters and setters are pretty dumb. And the whole getters and setters thing is just because the people who made C++ didn't know what they were doing. They never should have been... That concept of a getter and setter never should have existed in the first place, but due to the way that they deficiently did the design of C++, it's a natural thing that somebody might do if they weren't thinking it through all the way. So it's like... It's really... That one's on Screwstrip. That was a really, really bad... His design for the way member functions worked is like exceptionally bad. So yeah. So I'd say getters and setters might be one. But in general, I just don't like things that are overly complicated, like things where there's a lot of code that doesn't actually end up really doing very much. Tends to be the only thing that I really don't like. And I try to fight that as much as possible in my code as well. Like already in Handmade Hero, there's definitely some things that need to be simplified. But, you know, in general, I think in Handmade Hero, most of the stuff isn't too ridiculous. Like there aren't like giant systems that end up like setting one integer or whatever, but that's like actually a pretty common thing to see in some game code bases or other code bases where it's like, oh my god. Elvin, how do you deal with programming columns that use oop, getters, setters, etc.? Do you try to give them advice or stay away from them? And how do you deal with like, oh my god. Elvin, how do you deal with programming columns that use oop, getters, setters, etc.? Do you try to give them advice or stay away from them if possible? Yeah, I probably wouldn't work in that environment if I could avoid it. Like that, I would try to not work in a company that I had to do stuff like that. Ashmariel, I only know C++ really, but what's the alternative to getters, setters? The alternative is just to expose the variable, right? Is just to put the variable out in the thing. And so the real, so basically like, you know, brief little story, you got like 7 minutes left. So the first time someone told me about C++, so the first time, you know, brief little, and so the real, so basically like, you know, brief little, so basically like, you know, brief little story, you got like 7 minutes left. So the first time someone told me about C++, it was pretty funny because I thought they were describing something sensible. The first time someone told me about C++, they were like, you can make a class, right? You can say you can make this class. And they're like, and what you can do is you can make it so that there's functions, so that if you access stuff in the class, the functions get called, right? And what I thought they were talking about was this. I thought they were talking about something that would have looked like this, right? Here is the thing that I would make, and then someone in code, right, would do this. Oops. Someone in code would do this. Right? Does this make sense? What I thought they were talking about is that you could write this. They were like, you can make... So basically like, you know, brief little story, you got like 7 minutes left. So the first time someone told me about C++, it was pretty funny because I thought they were describing something sensible. The first time someone told me about C++, they were like, you can make a class, right? You can say you can make this class. And they're like, and what you can do is you can make it so that there's functions, so that if you access stuff in the class, the functions get called, right? And what I thought they were talking about was this. I thought they were talking about something that would have looked like this, right? Here is the thing that I would make, and then someone in code, right, would do this. Oops. Someone in code would do this. right? Does this make sense? What I thought they were talking about is that you could write this. Make sense? So without anyone having to change any of the code, it would just silently insert a call to this every time the value got set, and silently insert a call to this every time the variable was accessed. Make sense? Anyone with even like a small, like a teaspoon of functioning brain matter, which rules out strip, that's what you would do. Because this way, anyone who wrote code in the natural way you would write the code can just leave it, and the person who's implementing this class can override your access of that thing when and only when he needs to, right? It's really, really obvious that that's how an object-oriented programming language would work. It's just clear. And tons of programming languages do this. Like Inform does this. If you were programming an Infocom game, you would have had this, right? But instead, what this idiot does is he puts this thing down here, right? And he puts this thing up here, and he forces you to call it yourself. How is that even possible? Like, it boggles my mind that the dude was so dumb that he couldn't figure that out, that's ridiculous. It forces a dependency between whether the person who initially created the thing thought they were going to need to override it or didn't, right? It's just absolutely ridiculous. So as a result, by being so dumb, he created this like epidemic of what people do now, which is for every value, whether they need a getter or setter or not, they just create one, right? And the reason that they're creating one is because they don't know whether they're going to need to do it or not, and they don't want everyone to have to change their usage code, which is totally reasonable in some abstract sense, right? I suppose. But just forget about that, man. Just do this instead. And then if you ever need to do it, just go ahead, the rare times when you actually then need to do it, just put like an underscore at the end of it or drop it into the private section at that point, right? And change the like 50 places where it's actually accessed. It's way less work and saves everyone all of this ridiculous typing and nonsensical function calls and all this other stuff, right? Yeah, I mean, it's just like I said, I have no respect for these people. They're complete idiots, and I don't even know. It bothers me even to talk about this stuff because it's so dumb. Insofar as, what about a getter that does some calculation on private variables, like a getDay function in a class that stores an integer representation of time and date? You can still do that, right? That's totally still works. It's just a syntax. We're just talking about syntax. Manic the Nobody, John should do that for JI. He already did, I think. Manic the Nobody, John should do that for JI. He already did, I think. I think it already does that. The good version, not the bad version. Easy Sigh, C# does what you described. Yes, C# does, and so do a bunch of other languages. Like I said, it's obvious. It's very obvious. Like much like everything else in C++, the only people who didn't get it are the people who designed C++. Like everyone else, it's just painfully obvious. But like C++ and like its little malformed brother Java, they just always manage to like miss these super obvious things that you would just do. The getters and setters are less performant. Easy Treasy, the getters and setters are less performant too, right? Probably not if the compiler knows what it's doing at all. Cuber Caleb, I know you mostly work on code in smaller groups of people, although what is it like to program in teams and how does the work get split? Things that you would just do. Easy Treasy, the getters and setters are less performant too, right? Probably not if the compiler knows what it's doing at all. Cuber Caleb, I know you mostly doing it all. Cuber Caleb, I know you mostly work on code in smaller groups of people, although what is it like to program in teams and how does the work get split? The work gets split usually by what people are just implementing at the time, right? You know, it's like usually like, oh, okay, I'm going to work on this collision detection thing, so I'm doing the collision detection code. And typically, whoever went and did something first is typically the person who like ends up doing it later as well, on small teams. But at bigger companies and stuff like that, you know, you'll typically have stuff maybe where people are doing more, you know, sort of more top-down management, where you actually like decide like, oh, I'm going to give this up to this person or give this to the other person, and so on, right? Besides it, what about the downside that you don't know whether a value you're accessing does a function call or not? Well, that'd be a real difficult one for the C++ people to defend, since everything else they did doesn't tell you. Operator overloading does not tell you if you call a function. Construction does not tell you whether you call a function. Like, nothing in C++ tells you to call a function, except that one, and that's the one where you really don't want to have to know if you're calling a function, right? So it's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, it just frustrates me. I have no, it's just, they're just, such bad language design. Epically bad. Anyway, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Since I think I can only take so much griping about that particular topic. Thank you everyone for joining me for Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along at home, you can always pre-order the game and it comes with a source code, so if you want to play around with it, you can do that on handmadehero.org. You can also go to our forums and ask questions or view our annotated episode guide. You can go to the Patreon page to support the video series. You can go to the tweet bot to find out the schedule. And if you are in the mood to join us for our convention on December 5th, just this morning the speaker list was announced. Our convention, to find out the schedule. And if you are in the mood to join us for our convention on December 5th, just this morning the speaker list was announced, and it is pretty epic. You can actually type handmadecon.org. I actually registered a domain name that just goes directly there. And you can read about it. This is all the information about the location and all that stuff. And you can also buy the tickets here. And then we also had just today, as our blog post for the day, we introduced the speakers. It's going to be pretty awesome. It's kind of a crazy awesome lineup. Tommy Reffinis, obviously did Super Meat Boy, Mike Acton, the head of development at Insomniac for basically all the games, Ratchet & Clank, Resistance, etc. Blah 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 blah. Everything is here. Pat Wyatt, one of the original programmers on Warcraft and all the early Blizzard games, and then left and did ArenaNet, where he did the Guild Wars netcode and stuff. And then John Blow, obviously, talking about his language, Braid and the Witness, and then at the end, Ron Gilbert, who obviously the guy who did Secret of Monkey Island and invented the point-and-click adventure game. He's going to be talking, and yeah, it's going to be pretty awesome. I'm pretty excited about it. So it's going to be a pretty awesome programming con, and I'm trying to figure out how to get it streamed. It's been a real uphill battle trying to get someone to agree to stream it, but I'm looking to see if maybe now that the speakers are announced and people will take it a little more seriously. I don't know. Anyway, if you do want to go to that though, and you can make it to Seattle on December 5th, you can always buy tickets on the site, and then they're pretty cheap. The price goes up to $45 November 5th, so you still got a week or two to grab tickets at the discount price. All right, that's about it. I'll see you guys tomorrow back here, 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Until then, Have fun programming, and I will see you guys on the internet. Take it easy, everyone.